It lies a few miles north of Fort Collins, Colorado, and sits just outside of the Wyoming border. It is tucked in behind acres and acres of grazing land and accessible by only a small dirt road. It's easy to miss, and at first glance, easy to forget about. However, Soapstone Prairie Natural Area is so much more than what it first seems. It is emblematic of what makes Colorado unique amongst its fellow states. It sits at the geographic confluence where the waves of the Rocky Mountains crash against the sands of the Great Plains. Looking out across the rolling hills and gully-carved landscape, it is easy to imagine the way all of this must have felt before westward expansion claimed this continent with rifles and railroad ties. In between the dancing song of the meadowlark and the insistent tug of the breeze at the edge of your awareness, one can begin to fall into the soft embrace of the illusion of solitude. Still, though, if you find yourself in the right place at the right time, with the wind at your face and luck on your side, the sound of distant thunder may lay across the land, with not a cloud in the sky. It is the thunder made by hooves on churned ground, of a storm created by the meeting of history and the march of the future. Bison have returned to the plains of northern Colorado.
We're lucky to live right at the interface of the mountains and the plains, right? And so we have this pretty unique grassland ecosystem, and especially north of Fort Collins here, we're lucky to have a stretch of grasslands of prairie, shortgrass prairie, that's relatively intact.
The Soapstone area, and the significance of it is how far back it goes. It's like thousands of years. The Soapstone area has been visited and lived on, and had native peoples traveling and staying in that area. And I think about the connection that exists between indigenous people and the land. So I recognize the significance that area that it had to certain people.
I think bison in particular are really interesting because they were largely extirpated from their original range, which means they're largely absent from the areas where they used to roam freely. And they're now largely constrained to small, fragmented, fenced areas.
Bison, the significance to Native Americans goes way back, even back to some of our creation stories, where we came from. We've always had connection with animals and plants. And that's a big part of our identity as well, because the creation stories tell us where we come from and who we are as people, and then also how we rely on them for our survival, really, and then also how they rely on us as well.
The idea for the conservation herd actually, it probably originated 5 years or more before we actually created the herd. The city of Fort Collins had been interested in putting bison up at Soapstone Prairie Natural Area for some time, but prior to when the herd was actually established, I think just, things hadn't quite aligned perfectly to make the herd a possibility. And so to bring CSU into the fold with the city, and then eventually the county, and then the federal government as well. So yeah, it took a little bit of time, but it just also took the right people being in the right place at the right time.
Well, the idea of reintroducing bison to Soapstone Prairie and Red Mountain open space came about during the management plan process. So in the early 2000s, Soapstone was purchased by the city of Fort Collins. In about 2005, 2006, we started a public process to really understand how we wanted to manage the properties. During the public discussions, the concept of species reintroduction came up, bison being part of that. And it really became more of a voice the community had. Fort Collins is a fantastic community, great conservation patterns, great conservation ethic. And the community itself really wanted to pursue bison as a species brought back to Soapstone Prairie.
Because one of the goals of bison reintroduction on behalf of the city and county and others is to not only restore this sort of iconic species to grasslands where it once existed, but also to restore the sort of ecological functions or processes or role that that animal played in the ecosystem.
Well, bison are big ornery animals, and managing them is an art, and that's one of the skill sets that natural areas really didn't have. So one of the big challenges we faced was what to do with bison. The idea of bringing bison back, the romantic notion of it was pretty easy to get to, but the really hard question was, what do you do with the bison when they get there? The other difficult question we faced with, what do we mean by bison? If you think about the history of bison and them being nearly pushed to extinction, there are some genetic difficulties around bison. Many of the bison we see today contain cattle genes. It's just a remnant of when they were crossbred with cattle decades and decades ago. So bringing bison back to the landscape is relatively easy, but bringing bison with high levels of genetic integrity is a much more difficult challenge and a much more important conservation goal. And we decided if we're going to go to all the difficult work of bringing bison back to this landscape, we wanted to make sure it met a conservation goal. That being bringing genetic qualities of non-introgress bison, which the source of that material is very difficult. Yellowstone is one of the main pools of bison that are genetically pure, for lack of a better term. But that's also faced with issues of brucella and brucellosis.
So brucellosis is a bacterial disease, and it causes late-term abortions in livestock that contract it. It is zoonotic, which means that it can be passed between species, and in fact humans can get it as well. But once it gets into the natural environment like it has in the greater Yellowstone area, it can be really difficult to eradicate because the way it's passed is when those abortions do occur, when naive members of the herd come up and sniff that aborted fetus and come into contact with those fluids, they can pick up that bacteria and get infected. So, in a wild environment where you have bison that have it and elk that have it and other species that are potentially carriers, it can be really difficult to get rid of. Brucellosis, because it is a zoonotic disease and it can get into cattle herds, that can be a really big problem for cattle ranchers. So, from that perspective, it's really important to be able to ensure that any animals we put back out onto the landscape don't have that disease. And the Yellowstone animals are really valuable for a variety of reasons, one of which is that they, in their genetics, don't have any evidence of having been bred with cattle in the past. But the problem is that the herd in Yellowstone has a high incidence of brucellosis, so from a conservation perspective, it's really difficult to find ways to get those animals out of the park in a way that doesn't threaten other animals with the disease.
Yeah, every day in that decade time frame, there were many scenarios that got us to the brink of having bison at Soapstone that at the end just didn't fit or fell apart or a key partner slipped away. So there were a lot of false starts, and there were times where I thought this is not going to happen. It's just way too big an issue to solve. We can't figure this out. Yeah, the one key fact of overcoming those barriers was really time. It took a tremendous amount of focus over a long period of time to really systematically answer the questions we had before us. Any big conservation project takes time, and that's often missed in the public eye. You just see the results of decades of work or years of work in this case, but it really was years of work and years of focus and really working within partnerships to make this happen. The research that Dr. Barfield was doing, the ability to have access to animals that USGS provided, the landscape that had been conserved by the city and the county, all of that came together at the right time to bring bison back to this landscape in a way that made sense.
I would say we haven't gotten rid of the disease, but what we can do is help create offspring that don't have the disease and that aren't born in an environment where they're exposed to or potentially exposed to that bacteria. So what we did was we took animals that had tested positive for the disease, and for the females, we were able to collect embryos about a week after conception and take that embryo from a female that had the disease and put it into a female that didn't have the disease. And so when that calf is born, it's born into let's say, a brucellosis-free environment when it's in our facility, and we know that all of our animals are negative. I think what's really important for our animals in our herd and the ones that we put back out on the prairie is that we don't have that bacterium in our environment. So the chances of them coming into contacting it and contracting it here in Colorado and where the Laramie Foothills bison herd is very, very, very low.
I think cultural heritage is very important when in today's conservation efforts, especially like here in North America, is really having that indigenous voice included too, because you've had people living here again for thousands of years that are knowledgeable about the biodiversity that was here, the ecosystems, but the voice needs to be at the table too when there's talk about bringing bison back. When you bring something back, like the bison that have been gone for so long, how do you pay the proper respect to that animal? And in terms of like some of the ceremonial side of it, what was done to prepare those the bison to be released and to really show the proper respect is really it was really exciting to see that ceremony performed, the sage burning for that herd and the cleansing of the herd, and really sending them up to Soapstone in the proper way.
Four years ago, a small population of bison were reintroduced to Soapstone Prairie and Red Mountain Open Space. We then had this unique opportunity to step in and assess and evaluate and describe the plant and animal community before bison reintroduction and after bison reintroduction. But we also interviewed visitors to Soapstone natural area before and after bison reintroduction. And so we have both ecological and social results. And what was particularly interesting is that within the few years post bison reintroduction, we didn't see dramatic changes in the bird and mammal community, which is probably unsurprising because these are really dry, really arid or dry environments. But in contrast, what was quite interesting is we saw dramatic differences in how people talked about and thought about the prairie, the Soapstone Prairie, before and after bison reintroduction. And so after reintroduction, people felt a much stronger and more positive connection to grasslands or to prairie.
Place attachment involves the meanings, values, and connections that people have to a specific site. And it can be important for conservation because people have shown that place attachment is highly correlated with people participating in pro-environmental behaviors. And thus understanding place attachment can be important for knowing how bison in particular might be able to reconnect people to grassland systems.
And we thought the reintroduction of bison could help catalyze additional interest and attention and perhaps interest in conserving these grassland ecosystems, which again are sort of part of our unique natural heritage here in Colorado.
Place attachment increased, I think, after the bison reintroduction to Soapstone Prairie because people were, I think, really excited about the idea of this historic animal being restored to its natural habitat.
What a great way to connect people to place. And the Fort Collins and Larimer County community should be very proud of themselves for supporting a project that has this type of reach in terms of conservation of species. It doesn't stop with bison, black-footed ferrets, prairie dog conservation, bison. These are all very important things to do. And it all really boils down to the willingness of the local communities to support conservation in their back door, their backyard.
We also followed up questions about place attachment at Soapstone with an open-ended question, trying to understand why people were connected to Soapstone. And we asked them specifically why Soapstone Prairie Natural Area was important to them. And the number one answer to that was its value as a conservation area, indicating that bison elevated that grassland as an important area to be conserved for future generations.
Yeah, it's still one of the most common questions that I get from members of the local community, or how are the bison doing? How's it going? Are they calving? Are they healthy? Are they still up there? And so it really connected people to Soapstone, Red Mountain in ways that were different than before. I mean, people go up to the landscape. It's a beautiful, beautiful landscape to go into. But this provided another measure, another level of connection that people had.
Another part of like the bison herd that's out there, another really important part of it is the herd itself. Those animals are being sent to other tribes to really build up their herds as well. And what comes into play again is now you have the bison returning to those tribes.
Yeah, so because our goal was to be a seed herd, we're always looking for ways to get our animals out to other herds, to other places. We have given 2 bulls to the Pueblo of Poake in New Mexico. They manage a herd in partnership with the Denver Zoo at the Rio Mora National Wildlife Refuge. So we were really excited for 2 bulls to go there. We did send a young bull to the Minnesota Zoo, and that bull, he bred in the zoo population for a season and then was put out into the state park system. So he joined that group of animals. And then we just recently sent 2 bulls to the Oakland Zoo. They are working in partnership with the Blackfeet Nation to bring bison back to those lands. And so the 2 bulls will go to the zoo. They will breed there for a little while, but eventually they will also go back onto the landscape and be part of the herds that the Blackfeet are bringing back. It's been unbelievably, it's been almost 4 years. So November of 2019 will be 4 years. We started in 2015 with 10 animals. So we had 9 adult females and 1 bull calf. By introducing animals and allowing them to breed naturally on the prairie, we now have 77 in just 4 years. So we've had a tremendous amount of growth. So it's really exciting. And I think we've all just been really amazed with how quickly the herd has grown and how healthy and just how well they're doing out there.
What we would predict is that we would see a shift in perhaps the relative abundance, meaning how common different species are over time. What we mostly expect is we expect the vegetation community to change, because bison graze in such quite differently than cattle in some ways. So they're less dependent on water sources traditionally. So they're more likely to graze across the whole area, but they also graze in such a ways that they create and also wallow, which means they roll around in these sort of big dusty hollows in the ground. They create these areas where water can collect seasonally. And so essentially all of this activity combined ends up creating a much more heterogeneous or variable type of plant community with some short grass and some tall grass and some unvegetated areas. And all of those can be like little microcosms for life. So we expect overall potentially species richness or diversity to benefit from bison grazing.
And specifically, I think it would be important to understand that seeing the effects of these bison reintroductions on the ecological scale might take a longer period of time and potentially larger numbers of bison out on the landscape. I think it would be important to do a follow-up study for both the social and the ecological sides, because over time we might expect those ecological effects to manifest. And it would also be good to follow up to see if the social effects are being maintained, if we're seeing any changes there.
As the project moves forward, of course, we're going to continue to have calves every year. So we're hoping to give larger groups of animals to different herds across the country. And I think, we're always looking for ways to expand the footprint of the bison up at Soapstone Prairie Natural Area, but also at Red Mountain Open Space. Both of these landscapes are working landscapes. So we do have cattle ranchers who lease the land around us, and a lot of our ability to grow and to kind of see this herd continue to flourish will be working with those folks to find strategies for all of us to use the land in a way that conserves the land, but that benefits all of the animals who use it. And so we're always thinking about that and always communicating with our partners, but also with the people who use that landscape around us to try to find the best path forward. So hopefully in the future, we'll have more space and we can have a larger herd. We're just continuing to work towards that.
Seeing the bison return there for when they came back, it was like a return of a nation, really, like of something that's been missing for over 100 years. So seeing the bison back out there and flourishing again, it's just really moving, really, when you think about the biodiversity again it was something that was missing out there, and it's like they're there once again, and you can see that with the new calves being born and just how they're really flourishing once again. So to me, it really always brings a smile to my face, and I feel it's to me like it's really emotional to see them once again, just how majestic they are, and just again how they're flourishing and continuing to give back to that area.
I think as a conservation community and as more broadly as society and decision makers, we have a lot of really interesting discussions that we need to have to better understand what the future of bison will look like in Western North America. These are difficult conversations, but I see the future of bison conservation. We need to grapple with these in order to continue to restore and sustain this species over time.
And that's the key component with this bison, is it really is a conservation herd, and it's intended to be, because the genetics are so special and unique and non-introgressed with cattle genes. These are tremendously valuable animals from a conservation standpoint. So the ability to catch those animals and send them into other herds, either they're tribal or federal or state or whatever herds, that's critical to be able to have that source for genetic material, genetically pure animals to put into herd just for the conservation of a species. So this project does cross those bounds of being kind of this neat local story, but it also has some far-reaching conservation connections as well.
I think what's really special about the Laramie Foothills Bison Conservation Herd is how we had all of these different entities come together to make it happen. So, Colorado State University for the research side, the veterinary care, so the management and the ownership of the animals, the city and the county for providing the land and the infrastructure, and then our federal partners through the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service to help us access those genetics and to be experts on the disease and help us do that part of the project. And I think that's really important because it shows really what can happen when all of these folks come together for a common cause, even if within our individual institutions we have different goals for ourselves and our own involvement, but that we can take an animal like the bison and put it back out on the landscape where we can accomplish all of these ecosystem goals, these conservation goals for the species, but also help educate the public in a space where they can recreate and they can be, to help them understand and to value the larger conservation of the landscape and the species all at one time. And I think that provides an excellent model for other communities that might have the potential to do this type of thing. It's not something that would work everywhere in exactly the same way, but I think it helps people to think creatively in kind of this increasingly urban way that we live and how we can connect ourselves to the lands that are really just outside of our communities and make a bigger impact.
Being a part of a partnership that includes, the research going on with CSU, the Larimer County, and then working with City of Fort Collins, I see that the partnership leading to, really reconnecting peoples with the Soapstone area in general.
Yeah, I think it means a lot of things to me. One is just really emphasizes the value of really great partnerships and the kind of work that you can do, and it emphasizes to me the value that local communities and local organizations can have in the conservation of a species. Just the integrity of sort of that environmental ethic that Larimer County, that Fort Collins has to support projects like this. It's pretty unique in many ways. And I think what it also represents to me is really just, it doesn't stop here. It doesn't stop at turning the bison loose at Soapstone and having an animal on the landscape. It really opens up, almost endless possibilities of how do you better understand the connection this animal has to the landscape and to the people of the landscape. It's really kind of, chapter 2 or 3 of a 10 or 20 chapter book. So I think it's really here to stay, and I think there's some great possibilities in the future.
So for me personally, it means hope. It's a great example of how when you work closely together, collaboratively together, that you can successfully solve problems. To me, to go out on that day where those bison were released out onto the prairie and see them running across the prairie for the first time was just this incredible symbol of hope. And for me, really makes me feel positive about the future of conservation.
I think that the bison herd at Soapstone Prairie Natural Area represents hope for the conservation of bison herds across the Great Plains, for the conservation of the genetic lineage of the Yellowstone bison herd, for ecological conservation, cultural conservation, as well as galvanizing people to get excited about grassland conservation.
The herd for me is incredibly special for a lot of reasons. I mean, I feel personally connected to a lot of the animals, especially the ones that, I got to know when they were here on campus, the ones that we started the herd with, those first 10. You get to know the animals, you get to know their personalities, and then just kind of seeing them out there and living this lifestyle that is, in my mind, how it was meant to be on these larger landscapes and playing that ecological role. It's really meaningful, I think, for a lot of scientists who work at a lab bench and do really important research on a daily basis in the lab. We don't always get the opportunity to see that lab work translated into something in the field, back into the natural environment where others can enjoy it with them. And so that part of it has been really special to me. And I think when I started, it was really kind of the scientific question of, can we get around this disease with our research? And we've answered that question to a large extent, but then being able to connect what we were doing with a lot of the Native American communities and understanding what it means to them to have them back on this landscape, and to learn about the cultural connection that I had learned about superficially growing up and in my own education, but then to really become engaged in it and feel like you're playing a small role in it also is really meaningful to me. So it's just been an incredible learning experience, an incredibly rewarding one, and I'm really excited to see where it goes.
The Soapstone herd, when I think of the herd and I know how much they are flourishing and the impact they have to current tribes and the significance that the bison has to the ecosystem, I see them as a symbol of kind of like resistance in a way of resisting all the attempts to eradicate them, and how they are able to return once again. And I think about the resistance that happened within my family and how we continue to be here, and I feel like I have that connection with that Soapstone herd. So every time I hear news reports or see write-ups or even see them again, and it's important for me that I see them flourishing like that. And because we have some students that, if it wasn't for that animal, if it wasn't for the bison, they probably wouldn't be here. So much a part of their spirituality, so much a part of their religion and culture. To see that once again, and how I hope that they maintain that connection with it, and then when they look at a bison, they don't just think of it as an animal, they think of it as that really saved us as a people. And it's something that we should continue to respect and continue to make sure that they are a part of not only their lives, but other people understand that as well.